Montana Territory, 1878. The stagecoach wheels carved deep ruts into the muddy spring ground as Catherine Whitmore clutched a leather satchel containing everything that mattered. 23 letters written in careful script, a train ticket, stub from Philadelphia, and $47 that represented her entire fortune. Through the dusty window, she watched towering peaks emerge from morning mist, their snow-capped summits piercing a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. Somewhere in these untamed mountains waited Thomas Crawford, the man whose thoughtful correspondence had convinced her to abandon her seamstress position and journey 2,000 miles west to become his wife. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But what awaited Catherine wasn't the warm embrace of her intended husband or the cozy cabin he'd described in such loving detail. Instead, she would discover a tragedy that had unfolded weeks before her arrival, leaving nothing but charred ruins and a fresh grave marker. Yet sometimes the greatest disasters clear the way for unexpected miracles, and in the shadow of devastating loss, Catherine would encounter a mysterious figure who lived beyond the reach of civilization, a man who guarded secrets that could change everything. The final miles to Copper Falls stretched endlessly before them as the stagecoach lurched through treacherous mountain passes. Catherine pressed her handkerchief against her lips, fighting waves of nausea brought on by the constant swaying and the thin mountain air. At 24, she possessed the kind of practical beauty that served her well as a seamstress in Philadelphia. Auburn, hair that stayed neat even under difficult circumstances, steady green eyes that missed few details, and capable hands that had supported her through 3 years of independence following her father's death. Her traveling dress, a sensible brown wool that had seemed appropriate for the frontier, now felt woefully inadequate against the crisp mountain cold that seeped through the coach's wooden walls. The fabric had been her own creation, stitched during long evenings by lamplight while she read and reread Thomas Crawford's letters, each one painting a picture of life in the Montana Territory that grew more appealing with every word. Thomas had written about his timber operation, nestled in a valley where pine trees grew straight and tall, perfect for the growing demands of railroad construction spreading across the West. His descriptions of the cabin he'd built with his own hands, complete with glass windows and a wraparound porch overlooking a meadow where wildflowers bloomed in summer, had captured Catherine's imagination during the darkest days of the previous winter, when her tiny Philadelphia apartment felt like a prison and her future stretched ahead with monotonous predictability. The driver, a weathered man named Jasper Williams, whose face bore the map of 30 years navigating mountain roads, called out from his perch above, "Copper Falls ahead, miss, end of the line." Catherine's heart quickened as she smoothed the wrinkles from her dress and checked her reflection in a small hand mirror. The journey had taken its toll. Dust streaked her cheeks, and her hair had worked loose from its careful arrangement. But her eyes held the bright anticipation of a woman approaching a long-awaited reunion. The stagecoach shuddered to a halt in front of a collection of wooden buildings that constituted Copper Falls's main street. A general store stood alongside a blacksmith shop, their false fronts attempting to lend dignity to what was essentially a frontier supply station serving the scattered mining and logging operations in the surrounding mountains. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, and the sound of hammering echoed from the direction of what appeared to be a partially constructed hotel. "Thomas Crawford," Catherine called to the small group of onlookers who had gathered to witness the stagecoach's arrival, a weekly event that brought news and supplies from the outside world. "I'm Catherine Whitmore. Mr. Crawford was expecting me today." The faces that turned toward her held expressions that made her stomach clench with sudden foreboding. A middle-aged woman in a faded calico dress stepped forward, her weathered hands twisting in her apron. "Miss Whitmore," she said gently, "I'm Martha Henley. My husband runs the general store here." She paused, clearly struggling with what to say next. "I'm afraid there's been terrible news about Thomas Crawford." The world seemed to tilt beneath Catherine's feet. What kind of news? "There was a fire at his timber operation about 3 weeks back," Martha continued, her voice heavy with sympathy. "Started during a windstorm, spread faster than anyone could contain it. Thomas tried to save his equipment and—" She trailed off, unable to complete the devastating sentence. "And?" Catherine whispered, though she already knew what was coming. "He didn't make it out," said a gruff voice from behind Martha. The speaker was a tall man with greying temples and the kind of lined face that came from years of outdoor work. "I'm Frank Henley, Martha's husband. Thomas was a good man, miss. Did everything he could to fight that fire before it took his whole operation." Catherine felt the ground shifting beneath her, as if the mountain itself was betraying her. The leather satchel slipped from her nerveless fingers, spilling its contents onto the dusty street. Thomas Crawford's letters scattered in the wind, their careful words now meaningless promises from a man who would never fulfill them. "Where?" she began, then stopped to clear her throat. "Where is he buried?" "Up on the hill behind the old chapel," Martha said softly. "Reverend Morrison gave him a proper service, though there weren't many folks who could attend. Most everyone was fighting spot fires for days after the main blaze." Jasper Williams had finished unloading Catherine's trunk from the coach and was eyeing the mountain passes with the urgency of a man who wanted to begin his return journey before weather could trap him. "Miss, I'm sorry for your loss, but I need to head back while the light's good. These passes get treacherous after dark." Within moments, the stagecoach was disappearing around a bend in the mountain road, leaving Catherine standing alone with her possessions in a town where she knew no one and had no prospects. The reality of her situation began to settle like a physical weight on her shoulders. She had invested nearly everything in this journey: her savings, her independence, her future. The seamstress position in Philadelphia had been filled within days of her departure, and she had no family to take her in, even if she could afford the return journey. "There's a boarding house," Martha Henley offered kindly, gesturing toward a 2-story building with fresh white paint and green shutters. "Mrs. Patterson runs a clean establishment, $3 a week, meals included." $3 a week. Catherine quickly calculated that her remaining funds would last barely more than 2 months at that rate, assuming she spent nothing on anything else. Do you know if there's work available here for someone with sewing skills?" Frank Henley scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Town's growing, but slowly. Might be some mending work, maybe help with the hotel construction if you're handy with fabric for curtains and such. Won't pay much, though." "I'll take whatever's available," Catherine said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "But first, could someone direct me to Thomas's grave? I'd like to pay my respects." The walk to the small cemetery behind Copperfall's modest chapel took Catherine through the heart of the settlement. She observed everything with the careful attention of someone whose survival might depend on understanding her new environment. The town was rough, but not lawless. She saw evidence of community pride in the swept boardwalks and the carefully tended flower boxes outside the general store. Children played in a schoolyard while their mothers hung laundry and called greetings to neighbors. The cemetery occupied a peaceful slope overlooking the valley, surrounded by a whitewash fence that someone maintained with obvious care. Thomas Crawford's grave was easy to find. The wooden marker was new, carved with simple lettering that recorded his name, dates, and the words, "Beloved friend and neighbor." Someone had planted wildflowers around the base of the marker, their purple and yellow blooms a cheerful contrast to the somber setting. Catherine knelt beside the grave, placing her hand on the freshly turned earth. "I came, Thomas," she whispered. I kept my promise, even though you couldn't keep yours. The wind through the pine trees above created a sound like gentle breathing, and for a moment Catherine allowed herself to imagine it was Thomas responding to her words. She had never met him in life, yet his letters had created such a vivid picture of the man that his death felt like losing someone dear rather than a stranger. As she rose to leave, Catherine noticed another figure in the cemetery, a tall man in worn buckskins, who stood motionless beside a grave at the far end of the plot. Something about his stillness caught her attention. He wasn't actively mourning like someone in fresh grief, but rather maintaining a vigil that spoke of long-standing sorrow. His dark hair hung past his shoulders, and his bearded profile had the weathered quality of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. Their eyes met across the cemetery, and Catherine felt an unexpected jolt of recognition, not that she had seen him before, but that she was looking at someone who understood loss in the same immediate, personal way that she was experiencing it. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect before turning and walking away through the trees, moving with the silent grace of someone completely at home in the wilderness. The encounter lasted only seconds, but it left Catherine with the strange feeling that something significant had just occurred, though she couldn't define what. Mrs. Patterson's boarding house proved to be everything Martha Henley had promised: clean, comfortable, and operated with the kind of efficient kindness that made strangers feel temporarily at home. The proprietor was a widow in her 50s, whose own journey west had ended in Copper Falls, when her husband died of pneumonia during their first winter in Montana Territory. "Lost my Henry 8 years ago come November," she told Catherine as she showed her to a small but well-appointed room on the second floor. "Thought about heading back east, but something about these mountains gets into your blood. Besides, this town needs folks who understand how to build something lasting." The room contained a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand with a blue ceramic pitcher and basin, and a small desk positioned to catch the morning light from the single window. It was modest, but infinitely more comfortable than anything Catherine had expected to find on the frontier. "Supper's at 6, Mrs. Patterson continued. "You'll meet the other residents then. Mostly folks connected to the mining and logging operations, though we've got a school teacher and a minister's widow as well. Good people, all of them." Left alone, Catherine unpacked her few belongings and tried to formulate a plan for her immediate survival. Her sewing skills were considerable. She could create everything from men's work shirts to ladies' formal gowns, but the market for such services in a frontier town would be limited. She would need to be creative, perhaps offering to teach sewing skills to local women, or taking in mending work from the bachelor miners and loggers who made up much of the area's population. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The thought of Thomas's timber operation nagged at her throughout the afternoon. His letters had described a thriving business with contracts to supply railroad construction crews and mining operations throughout the territory. Surely there was salvageable equipment or remaining inventory that represented some value. As his intended wife, she might have some claim to whatever remained of his estate, though she had no idea how such matters were handled in the frontier territories. Supper in Mrs. Patterson's dining room provided Catherine with her first real introduction to Copper Falls society. The other residents included 2 miners, a supply wagon driver, the school teacher Martha Henley had mentioned, and an older gentleman who introduced himself as Judge Morrison, apparently serving multiple roles as both minister and legal authority for the small community. "Miss Whitmore," Judge Morrison said when Mrs. Patterson explained Catherine's circumstances, "I'm truly sorry for your loss. Thomas Crawford was a fine man who contributed much to our community's growth." "Thank you," Catherine replied. I wondered. That is, I have no experience with territorial law, but I'm curious about what typically happens to a man's property when he dies without family. The judge set down his coffee cup and regarded her thoughtfully. In most cases, unclaimed property reverts to the territorial government for auction. However, documented arrangements for marriage can sometimes establish a claim, particularly if the intended spouse has made significant financial investment in the arrangement. I have Thomas's letters, Catherine said carefully, spanning over a year of correspondence, and receipts showing my travel expenses to fulfill our marriage agreement. That could indeed establish grounds for a claim, Judge Morrison acknowledged. Though you'd need to file the appropriate papers quickly, territorial law requires action within 60 days of learning about a death to prevent property from being declared abandoned. One of the miners, a sun-weathered man named Pete Sullivan, leaned forward with interest. "Begging your pardon, miss, but are you thinking of trying to operate Crawford's timber business yourself?" The question was clearly meant to be helpful rather than mocking, but Catherine heard the underlying skepticism. "I honestly don't know enough about his operation to make that determination yet. I suppose my first step should be to see what remains after the fire. Most of his equipment was destroyed," Pete said sympathetically, "but the land itself might be worth something, and there could be cut timber that survived if it was stored away from the main operation." Judge Morrison nodded. "Agreement. The property is about 8 miles north of here, up toward Whispering Creek. Road passable by wagon, though you'd want someone familiar with the area to guide you." "I could arrange that," Mrs. Patterson offered. "My neighbor's boy Tommy knows those mountain roads better than anyone. He sometimes guided hunting parties before he started working at the sawmill." As the conversation continued around the dinner table, Catherine began to see a path forward, however uncertain. She could investigate what remained of Thomas's property, determine if she had any legal claim to it, and decide whether to attempt salvaging something from the ruins or simply sell whatever might have value. It wasn't the future she had planned, but it was a concrete course of action that might provide options beyond simple survival. After supper, Catherine stepped onto the boarding house's front porch to breathe the crisp mountain air and process the day's overwhelming developments. The sky had deepened to a rich purple, and stars were beginning to appear with an intensity she had never experienced in Philadelphia. The silence was almost complete, except for the distant sound of water running over rocks. Whispering Creek, she assumed, the waterway that gave the area part of its character. As she stood there, Catherine noticed a figure moving along the tree line at the edge of town. Even in the gathering darkness, she recognized the tall, silent man she had encountered at the cemetery earlier. He moved like smoke through the shadows, appearing and disappearing among the pines with such natural grace that she might have thought she was imagining him, if not for the brief moment when he paused and seemed to look directly at her across the distance. Then he was gone, melted back into the wilderness as if he had never been there at all. But the encounter left Catherine with the strangest feeling that their paths would cross again, and that when they did, everything would change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The mountains held secrets she was beginning to understand, and some of those secrets were watching her with eyes that had seen too much, and yet still held the capacity for something that might, eventually, become hope. Dawn broke over Copper Falls with the crisp clarity that only mountain mornings could provide. Catherine woke to the sound of wagon wheels on the street below and the distant ring of hammers as the town's craftsmen began their daily work. She dressed quickly in her most practical outfit, a dark blue skirt and white cotton blouse that would show dirt less readily than her traveling dress. and made her way downstairs for breakfast. Mrs. Patterson had outdone herself with a spread of flapjacks, bacon, and eggs that would fuel hard-working folks through a mountain morning. The other residents were already gathered around the large oak table, their conversation focused on the weather and the day's planned activities. "Tommy Brennan's waiting outside with his wagon," Mrs. Patterson announced as Catherine took her seat. "He's eager to guide you up to Crawford's place, though he warns the road's still muddy from the spring melt." Through the dining room window, Catherine could see a young man of perhaps 19 standing beside a sturdy wagon pulled by two patient-looking mules. His clothes were clean but well-worn, and his posture suggested the kind of confidence that came from years of navigating difficult terrain. Judge Morrison looked up from his coffee. "I took the liberty of preparing some preliminary legal documents," he said, sliding a folder across the table to Catherine. "Nothing formal yet, but forms for filing a property claim based on marriage intent. If you find anything worth claiming up there, you'll want to move quickly." "What sort of opposition might I face?" Catherine asked, accepting the folder with gratitude. "Hard to say," the judge replied thoughtfully. "Crawford didn't owe money to anyone in town, far as I know. But timber rights can be valuable, and there's always folks looking to snap up property at territorial auctions." Pete Sullivan, the miner who had spoken up the previous evening, wiped his mouth with his napkin and stood. "Miss Whitmore, if you don't mind some advice from someone who's seen his share of burned-out operations, be careful up there. Fire damage can make structures unstable, and spring runoff might have washed out sections of road that were solid last fall." Catherine thanked him for the warning and finished her breakfast quickly. Outside, Tommy Brennan proved to be a cheerful young man with an encyclopedic knowledge of every trail, creek, and landmark within 50 miles of Copper Falls. "I've been up to Crawford's place plenty of times," he said as he helped Catherine into the wagon seat. "Used to deliver supplies when he was expanding his operation. Real shame what happened. He was just starting to make good money with railroad contracts." The road out of Copper Falls climbed steadily through dense stands of pine and fir that blocked out most of the morning sun. Catherine found herself grateful for the wool shawl she had wrapped around her shoulders. The air was thin and sharp, carrying scents of pine needles and snowmelt that were completely foreign to her Philadelphia-trained senses. "You planning to stay in these parts?" Tommy asked as the wagon lurched through a particularly muddy section of road. "Not many single ladies try to make a go of it this far from civilization." "I haven't decided yet," Catherine admitted. "Much depends on what we find at Thomas's property," Tommy nodded understandingly. "Territory's not easy on folks, that's for certain, but it rewards those who stick with it. My pa came out here with nothing but a pickaxe and a mule. Now he owns 3 mining claims and a house in town." As they climbed higher into the mountains, Catherine began to understand why Thomas had been so enthusiastic about his chosen location in his letters. The views were spectacular, vast forests stretching towards snow-capped peaks that seemed to touch the sky itself. Eagles circled on thermal currents far overhead, and they passed several meadows where deer grazed without fear of the passing wagon. "Crawford's place is just around this next bend," Tommy announced after they had been traveling for nearly 2 hours. "Brace yourself, miss. It's not a pretty sight." Nothing could have prepared Catherine for the devastation that greeted them. Where Thomas's letters had described a thriving timber operation with a mill, several outbuildings, and stacks of cut lumber ready for transport, she saw only charred ruins and blackened earth. The fire had been so intense that even the metal parts of machinery had warped and twisted into unrecognizable shapes. The cabin Thomas had described with such loving detail, the one where they were to begin their married life, was nothing more than a stone foundation surrounded by ash. A single brick chimney stood like a lonely sentinel amid the destruction, its mortar darkened by smoke, but still intact. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," Tommy whispered, removing his hat as if they had entered a sacred space. I knew it was bad, but seeing it like this, Catherine climbed down from the wagon on unsteady legs. The scope of the destruction was overwhelming, but she forced herself to walk among the ruins with a practical eye. If she was going to make any kind of claim on this property, she needed to understand exactly what remained. The stone foundation of the cabin was solid and well built, she observed. Thomas had mentioned in his letters that he had quarried the stone himself from a site higher up the mountain, selecting each piece for its durability and appearance. A cabin could be rebuilt on this foundation, though it would require significant investment in materials and labor. Mill machinery's a total loss, Tommy said, poking at a twisted mass of metal with a stick. But the water wheel mechanism might be salvageable. Some of them iron parts look like they could be reworked. Beyond the main destruction, Catherine discovered that not everything had been consumed by the flames. A storage shed, built well away from the mill, had survived with only minor damage to its roof. Inside, she found stacks of seasoned lumber that Thomas had apparently been preparing for a special order. Expensive hardwood that would be valuable to the right buyer. "This timber's worth something," Tommy confirmed when she called him over. "Who examine her find? Oak and cherry trees like this don't grow natural up here. Crawford must have had it shipped in special." There was also a small workshop that had escaped the worst of the fire damage. Its contents told the story of a man who took pride in his craftsmanship. Hand tools arranged with military precision, half-finished furniture pieces that showed real artistry, and detailed drawings of lumber mill improvements tacked to the walls. As Catherine explored, she began to piece together a more complete picture of Thomas Crawford. His letters had revealed an intelligent, thoughtful man, but his physical environment showed someone with considerable mechanical aptitude and an eye for quality that went beyond mere function. The mill he had designed incorporated several innovations that even her untrained eye could recognize as improvements over typical lumber processing operations. "Found something interesting over here," Tommy called from near the remains of the mill. Catherine joined him beside what appeared to be a small office structure that had partially survived the fire. The roof was gone, and one wall had collapsed, but a heavy metal safe sat in what had been the corner, apparently undamaged by the flames. "Think there might be important papers inside?" Catherine asked. "Could be. Crawford was the methodical type, kept records of everything." Tommy examined. "The safe's door. Lock doesn't look damaged. You happen to know if he mentioned a combination in any of his letters?" Catherine thought back through her correspondence with Thomas. He had been careful about business details, but not secretive. He mentioned using his birthday for important things. July 15th, 1845. Tommy tried several combinations based on those numbers before the safe clicked open with a satisfying sound. Inside, they found exactly what Catherine had hoped for: business records, contracts, correspondence with railroad purchasing agents, and most importantly, a will that had been properly witnessed and notarized. Catherine's hands trembled as she read the simple document. Thomas had indeed intended to marry her, and in the event of his death before their wedding, he bequeathed his entire estate to Miss Catherine Whitmore of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, who has agreed to become my wife and partner in building a life in the Montana Territory. "Well, that settles the legal question," Tommy said, reading over her shoulder. "Judge Morrison will have to recognize your claim with documentation like this." Among the other papers, Catherine found something even more valuable than legal proof. Of inheritance, Thomas's business plan for expanding the timber operation. His notes revealed contracts already negotiated with 3 different railroad construction crews, orders for specialty lumber that would pay premium prices, and detailed plans for rebuilding the mill with improvements that would increase both efficiency and profit. He was thinking big. Tommy observed, studying the business documents. These railroad contracts alone would keep a mill running steady for 2 years, maybe 3. But the most intriguing discovery was a hand-drawn map tucked inside the back cover of Thomas's record book. It showed the immediate area around his property with several locations marked in different colored inks. Some were labeled as timber stands ready for cutting, others as potential mill sites, and one, marked with a red circle and the notation exceptional opportunity, appeared to be located in a remote valley several miles deeper into the mountains. "You know anything about this location?" Catherine asked Tommy, pointing to the red circle. Tommy studied the map carefully. "That's up toward Devil's Canyon country, real remote area. Most folks avoid it because the terrain's so rough. But Crawford was always exploring, looking for the best timber stands." He frowned thoughtfully. "Though I heard there's someone living up that way. Mountain man type, keeps to himself." A memory stirred in Catherine's mind. The tall, silent figure she had encountered at the cemetery and glimpsed again from the boarding house porch. Could that be the same person Tommy was referring to? "What kind of man?" she asked, trying to keep her tone casual. "Don't rightly know," Tommy admitted. "Seen him in town maybe twice in the past year, always alone, never stays long, buys supplies, and disappears back into the high country. Folks call him Daniel Thorne, though I couldn't say if that's his real name or just what he goes by." As they prepared to load the salvageable items from Thomas's property into the wagon, Catherine found herself studying the map more closely. Whatever Thomas had discovered in that remote valley, he had considered it significant enough to mark as an exceptional opportunity. Given his methodical nature and business acumen, that notation couldn't be dismissed lightly. The return journey to Copper Falls gave Catherine time to process everything she had learned. She now had legal claim to valuable property, contracts, that could provide steady income if she could find a way to fulfill them, and enough salvageable materials to justify rebuilding efforts. But she also faced the daunting reality that operating a timber business would require skills and resources she didn't possess. "Tommy," she said, as they descended toward town, "hypothetically speaking, what would it take to rebuild Thomas's operation?" "Depends on how ambitious you want to be," he replied, considering the question seriously. "Basic mills set up to handle railroad contracts might run $800 to $1,000, plus labor costs. But that's assuming you can find someone who knows mill construction and timber processing." $800 to $1,000. Catherine's heart sank as she calculated the impossibility of raising such a sum. Her remaining funds wouldn't cover 1/10 of that amount, and she had no collateral for borrowing such money, even if a bank existed in Copper Falls. "Course," Tommy continued, "there might be other approaches. Partnership with someone who has the skills and maybe some capital, or starting smaller, fulfilling contracts with hand-cut lumber while you build up resources for mill reconstruction." Partnership. The word resonated with Catherine as they entered Copper Falls' main street. Thomas's business documents had shown him to be a man who planned for contingencies. Perhaps he had considered the possibility of needing an experienced partner to help fulfill his ambitious expansion plans. Back at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, Catherine spread Thomas's papers across the desk in her room and began making detailed notes. The will established her legal right to the property, but making it profitable would require careful planning and probably assistance from someone with timber industry experience. Judge Morrison arrived as she was finishing her documentation review. Mrs. Patterson had sent word about their discoveries, and he was eager to examine the legal documents. "This will is ironclad," he announced after studying it carefully. "Properly witnessed, notarized by a territorial official, and specific in its bequests. You'll need to file formal papers, but there's no question about your legal standing." "What about these business contracts?" Catherine asked, showing him Thomas's correspondence with railroad purchasing agents. The judge whistled softly as he read through the agreements. These represent substantial commitments, thousands of board feet of lumber delivered on specific schedules. Very profitable if you can meet the terms, but there are penalty clauses for non-delivery that could be financially devastating. Catherine's momentary elation faded as the judge explained the technical requirements for fulfilling the contracts. Not only would she need to rebuild the mill, but she would also need teams of experienced loggers, transportation equipment, and processing facilities capable of producing lumber to exact specifications. However, Judge Morrison added thoughtfully, territorial law allows for assignment of these contracts to qualified parties, provided both sides agree to the transfer. You might consider partnering with an established operation that could handle fulfillment while sharing profits. As evening approached, Catherine found herself back on the boarding house porch, watching shadows lengthen across the mountain landscape. The day's discoveries had given her legal ownership of valuable assets, but had also revealed the enormous challenges of making those assets productive. Mrs. Patterson joined her with 2 cups of coffee. "Penny for your thoughts, dear. I'm trying to decide whether I'm brave enough to attempt something I know nothing about, or foolish enough to think I can succeed where others might fail," Catherine replied honestly. "In my experience," Mrs. Patterson said, settling into the chair beside her, "the two often amount to the same thing. Every success story in this territory started with someone taking on challenges that seemed impossible." As they sat in comfortable silence, Catherine's attention was drawn to movement at the tree line beyond town. For the 3rd time in 2 days, she glimpsed the tall figure moving through the shadows with that distinctive silent grace. This time, however, he didn't disappear immediately. Instead, he paused at the edge of the clearing and seemed to study the town with the careful attention of someone gathering information. "Mrs. Patterson," Catherine said quietly, "do you know anything about a man named Daniel Thorne?" The older woman's expression grew thoughtful. "Strange fellow. Lives somewhere up in the high country. Comes to town maybe 3 or 4 times a year for supplies. Always polite, pays in cash, but doesn't socialize. Why do you ask? I've seen him several times since arriving, at the cemetery, and again just now at the tree line." Mrs. Patterson followed Catherine's gaze, but the figure had vanished once. "Again. Harmless, far as anyone knows. Though there are stories." "What kind of stories?" "Oh, the usual mountain man tales. Some folks say he's running from something back east. Others claim he's sitting on a rich mining claim but doesn't want attention. Mostly just speculation born of curiosity about a man who chooses such isolation." That night, as Catherine reviewed Thomas's business papers one more time before sleep, her eyes kept returning to the map with its mysterious red circle marking an exceptional opportunity in the remote mountains. Whatever Thomas had discovered, in that distant valley, it had been significant enough to mark specially, and somewhere in that same wilderness lived a man who seemed to appear whenever Catherine was facing important decisions about her future. Coincidence, perhaps. But Catherine was beginning to suspect that in the Montana territory, very few things happened by pure chance. The mountains had their own way of bringing together the people and circumstances needed to forge new possibilities from the ruins of old plans. Tomorrow, she would file the legal papers to formalize her claim to Thomas's estate. But increasingly, she found herself wondering if her real future lay not in the burned-out ruins of Whispering Creek, but in the uncharted valleys beyond, where secrets waited to be discovered and partnerships might be forged with men who understood the true value of mountain solitude and the opportunities it could hide. The territorial courthouse in Copper Falls occupied a modest log building that also served as the town's meeting hall and occasional church when Reverend Patterson visited. From Helena, Catherine arrived early, clutching the leather portfolio containing Thomas's will and business documents. Judge Morrison had arranged to meet her there before his regular office hours to process her inheritance claim without the usual crowd of curious onlookers. "Everything appears to be in perfect order," the judge announced after reviewing the paperwork. One final time, he stamped the official seal onto Catherine's ownership documents with a decisive thump. "As of this moment, you are the legal owner of the Crawford timber operation and all associated property rights." Catherine felt a mixture of triumph and terror as she accepted the official papers. Legal ownership was one thing. Knowing what to do with that ownership was entirely another matter. "Now, about those railroad contracts," Judge Morrison continued, adjusting his spectacles. "I've taken the liberty of examining the terms more closely. The penalties for non-delivery are severe, but there's also a clause allowing for assignment to qualified subcontractors, provided the railroad company approves the substitution. Meaning you could potentially partner with an established timber operation to fulfill the contracts while retaining ownership of the property and a percentage of the profits. It's done regularly in territorial business arrangements." The judge pulled out a map of the region and spread it across his desk. "There are 3 major timber operations within reasonable distance of your property. Morrison Lumber, no relation. To Me operates about 15 miles south near Boulder Creek. They have the equipment and experience, but are reportedly struggling to secure adequate timber rights for their existing contracts." Catherine studied the map as he pointed out the various operations. "What about the others?" "Blackstone Timber runs a large operation out of Silver City, but they're primarily focused on mining support structures. Profitable but limited market scope." His finger moved to a third location. "Then there's Jackson Brothers Logging, family operation with an excellent reputation for quality work, but they're small scale compared to what your contracts would require." None of the options felt quite right to Catherine. Partnering with a larger operation would mean surrendering most control over Thomas's carefully planned business, while the smaller operations lacked the capacity to handle the substantial railroad orders. "There is one other possibility, Judge," Morrison said thoughtfully, "though it's considerably more unconventional." "What kind of possibility?" "Individual partnership rather than corporate assignment. Find someone with the specific skills needed to rebuild and operate the mill. Offer them partnership terms in exchange for their expertise and labor investment." Catherine considered this option as she gathered her documents. "Would such an arrangement be legally binding?" "Absolutely, provided the terms are clearly documented and properly witnessed. Might be your best option for maintaining control while getting the expertise you need." After leaving the courthouse, Catherine walked through Copper Falls with new eyes. As the legal owner of valuable property and business contracts, she was no longer simply a stranded mail-order bride dependent on charity. Yet the challenges ahead seemed more daunting than ever. Frank Henley hailed her from outside his general store. "Congratulations on making your claim official, Miss Whitmore. Word's already spreading about them railroad contracts you inherited." "Word travels quickly in a small town," Catherine observed. "Indeed it does. In fact, I've had 3 different folks ask about your situation just this morning." Frank's expression grew serious. "Might want to be careful who you discuss business with. Not everyone in these parts has honorable intentions when it comes to valuable timber rights." This warning proved prophetic when Catherine encountered her first serious complication an hour later. She was examining the contents of Thomas's workshop materials that Tommy had transported to town when a well-dressed stranger approached her outside Mrs. Patterson's boarding house. "Miss Whitmore, I presume?" The man was perhaps 40, with the kind of polished appearance that spoke of urban success. His clothes were expensive but practical, suggesting someone who conducted business in frontier settings but maintained Eastern standards. "I'm Harrison Caldwell, representing the Territorial Development Corporation out of Helena." Catherine set down the box of tools she had been inventorying. How can I help you, Mr. Caldwell? I understand you've recently inherited the Crawford, a timber operation, along with some substantial railroad supply contracts. My company specializes in helping inexperienced property owners maximize the value of their territorial assets. The phrasing set Catherine's teeth on edge. In what way? Caldwell smiled with practiced charm. We offer complete buyout services at guaranteed fair market value, eliminating the risks and complexities of attempting to operate unfamiliar businesses. In your case, given the destruction of the mill and the time constraints on those railroad contracts, I'm authorized to offer $800 cash for immediate transfer of all rights and obligations. $800 represented more money than Catherine had ever possessed at one time, but something about Caldwell's manner triggered her suspicions. That's a generous offer, Mr. Caldwell. May I ask how your company learned about my inheritance? So quickly? News travels in business circles, Miss Whitmore. Territorial Development maintains contacts throughout Montana to identify emerging opportunities. And what would your company do with the timber operation? Caldwell's smile became slightly strained. We have established relationships with qualified operators who can fulfill the railroad contracts efficiently. Our primary concern is ensuring that valuable territorial resources aren't wasted due to inexperience. Catherine folded her arms across her chest. I appreciate your concern, but I'm not ready to make any decisions about selling. Perhaps you could leave your contact information in case I change my mind. Of course, Caldwell agreed, though his tone suggested disappointment. However, I should mention that our offer is time-sensitive. Market conditions change rapidly, and delay often reduces value significantly. After Caldwell departed, Catherine sought out Judge Morrison to discuss the encounter. She found him in his makeshift office behind the courthouse, reviewing territorial property records. Harrison Caldwell, the judge mused when she described her visitor. Haven't heard that name specifically, but the Territorial Development Corporation is well known. They specialize in acquiring properties from folks who inherit more than they can handle. Is that necessarily dishonest? Not dishonest, exactly, but they don't typically offer fair market value. $800 for property and contracts potentially worth several thousand suggests they expect significant profit from the transaction. This information reinforced Catherine's instinctive distrust of Caldwell's offer. If the timber operation and railroad contracts were as valuable as Judge Morrison suggested, selling immediately would be financial foolishness, regardless of the challenges involved in keeping them. That afternoon brought an unexpected development when Tommy Brennan appeared at the boarding house with news that would change everything. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by obvious excitement, "I've been thinking about that map you found in Crawford's papers, the one marking that remote valley location." "What about it?" "Well, I got curious and asked around. Turns out my Uncle Patrick knows that country pretty well from his trapping days. He says there's something unusual about that particular valley." Catherine invited Tommy into the boarding house parlor where they could speak privately. "What kind of unusual?" "According to Uncle Patrick, there's a hidden valley up there that's completely protected from winter storms by the surrounding peaks. Creates its own microclimate, warmer temperatures, longer growing season, natural springs that never freeze. But more importantly for your situation, it's got some of the finest timber stands in the territory." Catherine felt her pulse quicken. "Your uncle has seen this valley? He guided a surveying party through there about 5 years back. Said the timber was so dense and high quality, it looked like something from the old growth forests back east. Problem is, it's incredibly remote, and the approaches are treacherous for wagon transport. But if someone could access it, and develop a way to get the timber out, they'd have access to lumber worth a fortune, the kind of specialty hardwood that brings premium prices for railroad cars and fine construction. This revelation cast Thomas's notation about an exceptional opportunity in an entirely new light. He hadn't been marking a potential timber stand. He had identified a source of premium lumber that could supply his railroad contracts at profit margins far exceeding typical operations. "Tommy," Catherine said carefully, "does your uncle know anything about the man who lives up there? Daniel Thorne?" Tommy's expression grew thoughtful. "Funny you should ask. Uncle Patrick mentioned something about that when I told him you'd been asking about the area. Said there's definitely someone living in that country, but it ain't just some random hermit." "What do you mean?" "Patrick thinks whoever it is has been developing the valley systematically. He's seen evidence of selective timber-cutting trail, improvements, even what looked like the beginnings of a narrow-gauge railway system for moving lumber down the mountain." Catherine's heart began racing as the implications became clear. If Daniel Thorne was already working to develop timber resources in that hidden valley, he possessed exactly the skills and knowledge she needed to fulfill Thomas's contracts. More importantly, he was already operating in the location that Thomas had identified as the key to maximizing the timber operations potential. "Could your uncle guide someone to this valley?" she asked. Tommy hesitated. He could, but he's hesitant about intruding on whatever operation this Thorne fellow has established. Mountain folks take their privacy seriously, and there's no telling how he'd react to uninvited visitors. That evening, Catherine found herself once again on the boarding house porch, staring into the mountains and pondering her options. The day's developments had revealed both the potential value of her inheritance and the complexity of realizing that value. Caldwell's buyout offer represented immediate financial security, but would mean abandoning any hope of building the successful business that Thomas had envisioned. Attempting to fulfill the railroad contracts independently would require skills and resources she didn't possess, but partnering with the mysterious Daniel Thorne might provide access to both the expertise and the premium timber needed for success. Mrs. Patterson joined her with the coffee that had become their evening ritual. "You look like a woman wrestling with momentous decisions." "I'm trying to decide whether to take a guaranteed $800 or risk everything on a partnership with a man I've never met who lives in a hidden valley that might or might not exist." Mrs. Patterson chuckled. "When you put it like that, it does sound like a choice between sanity and madness. But then again, every worthwhile venture in this territory started with someone choosing what seemed like madness at the time." As they talked, Catherine became aware of a familiar presence at the tree line. Daniel Thorne stood motionless among the pines, his tall figure barely visible in the gathering dusk. This time, however, instead of disappearing when she noticed him, he stepped into the clearing and began walking directly toward the boarding house. "Well," Mrs. Patterson murmured, "it appears your mysterious mountain man has decided to introduce himself." Catherine's heart hammered as Daniel Thorne approached. Up close, he was even more imposing than she had realized, well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and the kind of weathered features that spoke of years in harsh conditions. His dark hair was longer than fashionable, but clean and well kept, and his beard was neatly trimmed rather than wild. Most striking were his eyes, a deep brown that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. His clothes were practical frontier wear, but of good quality, well-maintained and obviously chosen for function rather than appearance. Everything about him suggested competence and self-sufficiency taken to levels that most people never achieved. "Miss Whitmore," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect. His voice was deep and quiet, with the kind of controlled tone that suggested he chose his words carefully. "I understand you've inherited Thomas Crawford's timber operation." "Yes," Catherine managed, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "And you're Daniel Thorne." "I am." He glanced at Mrs. Patterson, who was making no pretense of giving them privacy. Might we speak privately about a matter of mutual interest? Mrs. Patterson rose gracefully. I'll just go check on things in the kitchen, she said with a meaningful look at Catherine. When they were alone, Daniel Thorne settled into the chair Mrs. Patterson had vacated, moving with the controlled grace Catherine had noticed from a distance. I knew Thomas Crawford, he said without preamble. We had discussed the possibility of a business arrangement before his death. Catherine felt a jolt of excitement mixed with wariness. What kind of business arrangement? Timber access in exchange for processing expertise. Thomas had identified resources that I could provide, while I needed access to established transportation and marketing networks that his railroad contracts represented. The valley marked on his map? Thorne's eyebrows rose slightly, suggesting surprise that she knew about that detail. Among other resources, yes, Thomas was remarkably thorough in his research. Catherine studied his face, trying to read the man behind the carefully controlled expression. Mr. Thorne, may I speak plainly? I prefer it. I've inherited Thomas's property and contracts, but I have no experience running a timber operation. I've been offered $800 to sell everything immediately, which would solve my immediate problems but abandon Thomas's plans entirely. Alternatively, I could attempt to find partners who could help me fulfill the railroad contracts, while maintaining ownership of the operation. Thorne was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the mountains rising beyond the town. What did you know about Thomas's character from his letters? The question seemed oddly personal, but Catherine answered honestly. He struck me as intelligent, hard-working and ambitious, but also thoughtful and honest, someone who planned carefully and kept his commitments. An accurate assessment. Thomas spent considerable time researching timber resources in this region before approaching me about accessing my valley. He wasn't interested in quick profits. He wanted to build something sustainable that would benefit everyone involved. And now his partner is dead. His mill is destroyed, and his contracts face default unless someone can fulfill them within the next few months. Thorne's gaze returned to Catherine. The question is whether you're interested in honoring Thomas's vision or simply looking for the quickest way to convert your inheritance into cash. The directness of the question stung, but Catherine appreciated its honesty. Mr. Thorne, if I were only interested in quick cash, I would have accepted Mr. Caldwell's offer this morning. I'm here because I believe Thomas's plans had merit, and because I'm not ready to surrender without at least exploring alternatives. Something in Thorne's expression shifted slightly, though Catherine couldn't interpret the change. What would you need to know to make an informed decision about partnership? Everything. The condition of your timber resources, your processing capabilities, your estimates for fulfilling the railroad contracts, and your terms for partnership. Thorne stood, his decision apparently made. My valley is a day's ride from here through difficult terrain. If you're serious about partnership, you'll need to see the operation firsthand to understand what you'd be committing to. Catherine felt a thrill of excitement mixed with apprehension. When? Tomorrow, if you're prepared for mountain travel. Fair warning, the journey isn't suitable for Eastern sensibilities or fashionable clothing. I'll be ready, Thorne nodded once, a gesture that seemed to seal some kind of agreement between them. Meet me at the livery stable at dawn. Bring only what you can carry in a saddle pack and dress for cold weather regardless of the valley temperature. As he prepared to leave, Catherine found herself with one more question. Mr. Thorne, why are you willing to consider partnership with someone you don't know who has no experience in the timber business? He paused, and for the first time since approaching the boarding house, his carefully controlled expression revealed something that might have been genuine emotion. Because Thomas Crawford trusted you enough to leave you everything he'd worked to build. If his judgment was sound enough to identify the potential in my valley, it was probably sound enough to choose the right person to carry forward his plans. With that, he disappeared into the darkness as silently as he had appeared, leaving Catherine alone on the porch with a decision that would determine not just her immediate future, but the entire course of her life in the Montana Territory. Tomorrow, she would venture into the unknown mountains with a man she barely knew, to see a valley that existed more in legend than reality, to evaluate a partnership that could either fulfill Thomas Crawford's ambitious dreams or lead to disaster. In the wilderness, but as she sat beneath the brilliant mountain stars, Catherine discovered that the prospect of the unknown no longer frightened her. For the first time since leaving Philadelphia, she felt as though she was moving toward something meaningful rather than simply away from disappointment. Catherine woke before dawn to the sound of horses snorting in the crisp mountain air. Through her window, she could see Daniel Thorne already at the livery stable, checking saddles and packs with the methodical attention of someone who understood that survival in the wilderness depended on proper preparation. She dressed quickly in her most practical clothing, wool riding skirt, cotton blouse, and the sturdy boots she had purchased for farm work that now seemed prophetic. Mrs. Patterson met her in the kitchen with a cloth bundle containing bread, cheese, and dried meat. "I've packed enough for 2 days, though Daniel said you'd be back tonight," she said, studying Catherine's face for signs of second thoughts. "Are you certain about this, dear? Riding into the mountains with a man you barely know seems reckless," Catherine finished, accepting the food pack gratefully. "Perhaps, but everything worthwhile I've done since leaving Philadelphia has seemed reckless to outside observers. Just remember that mountain weather can change without warning, and that man, honorable as he seems, is still largely a mystery to those of us who've known him only from a distance." Catherine appreciated the concern behind the warning, even as she recognized her own determination to see this through. "Mrs. Patterson, if something were to happen to me, there's a letter for Judge Morrison in my room, containing instructions about my property, but I don't expect trouble." The older woman nodded, understanding that some decisions couldn't be made safely. "Trust your instincts, Catherine. They've served you well so far." At the livery stable, Catherine found Thorne examining a sturdy chestnut mare with the practiced eye of someone who judged horses by capability rather than appearance. The animal was compact but well-muscled, with intelligent eyes and the kind of sure-footed build that suggested mountain breeding. "She's steady on difficult terrain," Thorne said without preamble, handing Catherine the reins. "Name's Copper, and she knows these trails better than most people. Stay close and follow my lead. Some sections require a single file through narrow passes." Thorne's own mount was a larger animal, a bay gelding with the powerful hindquarters needed for climbing. Steep grades while carrying heavy packs. Everything about the man's preparation spoke of extensive wilderness experience, from the way he distributed weight in his saddle packs to his choice of a rifle that balanced accuracy with reliability. As they rode out of Copper Falls in the grey light before sunrise, Catherine felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation that reminded her of her first day aboard the train leaving Philadelphia. She was once again venturing into unknown territory, trusting her future to decisions that seemed logical but untested. "The first part of the journey follows established trails," Thorne explained, as they climbed steadily through dense pine forests. "After about 3 hours, we'll leave the main routes and take paths that aren't marked on any territorial maps." Catherine adjusted to Copper's gait, finding the mare responsive but not skittish. "How long have you been developing your valley?" 4 years of serious work, though I've been living in that country for 6. Started as a trapping operation, but the timber potential became obvious once I understood the unique climate conditions. The trail wound through increasingly spectacular scenery as they climbed higher into the mountains. Catherine found herself constantly amazed by vistas that seemed to expand with every turn. Vast forests stretching to distant peaks, eagles soaring on thermal currents, and the constant sound of water running over stone as they crossed numerous mountain streams. Thomas mentioned in his business notes that railroad demand for specialty lumber was increasing rapidly, Catherine said during a brief rest to water the horses. Is that what drew your interest to commercial timber operations? Thorne considered the question while checking his gelding's hooves for stones. Partly, but also recognition that individual trapping and small-scale farming wouldn't provide the resources needed to properly develop the valley's potential. Thomas understood that sustainable prosperity requires matching resources with market demand through appropriate scale operations. His answer revealed more education and business sophistication than Catherine had expected from someone living in wilderness isolation. Were you involved in business before coming to Montana? Engineering, Thorne replied simply. Railroad construction, specifically. Learned about timber requirements from direct experience with what works and what doesn't in heavy construction applications. This revelation cast Thorne's wilderness expertise in a new light. He wasn't simply a mountain man who had stumbled onto valuable timber resources. He was someone with professional knowledge of exactly how to develop and market those resources for maximum profit. As they continued climbing, the character of the forest began changing. The trees grew larger and more densely packed, with species Catherine didn't recognize, mixed among the familiar pines and firs. The air itself seemed different, cleaner and somehow richer, as if they were entering a region where natural processes operated more efficiently. We're approaching the outer boundaries of the valley's influence, Thorne explained, noting her attention to their surroundings. The protected geography creates conditions that support forest growth beyond what's typical for this elevation. Hour later, they reached what appeared to be an impassable wall of rock rising vertically from the forest floor. Catherine couldn't see any path forward until Thorne dismounted and began leading his horse toward what looked like a solid cliff face. As they drew closer, she realized that shadows had concealed a narrow opening in the rock, a passage barely wide enough for a mounted rider. This is why the valley remained undiscovered for so long, Thorne said, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. Unless you know exactly where to look, the entrance appears to be nothing more than another rock formation. The passage through the cliff extended for nearly a quarter-mile, winding through darkness, broken only by occasional shafts of sunlight from above. Catherine felt a moment of claustrophobia, but Copper moved forward confidently, suggesting the mare had traveled this route many times before. When they finally emerged into daylight, Catherine gasped at the transformation in their surroundings. They stood at the edge of a valley that seemed to exist in a different world from the rugged mountain country they had been traveling through. The depression was perhaps 2 miles across and 3 miles long, completely enclosed by towering peaks that formed a natural fortress against weather and intrusion, but it was the forest that took Catherine's breath away. Trees of enormous size and obvious age rose from rich soil that supported undergrowth more lush than anything she had seen even in Pennsylvania's old growth areas. Oak, maple, and cherry grew alongside pine and fir in combinations that seemed impossible at this elevation. A crystal-clear stream meandered through meadows where wildflowers bloomed in profusion despite the early summer date. "My God," Catherine whispered, turning in her saddle to take in the full scope of the hidden valley. "It's like something from a fairy tale." Protected from extreme weather by the surrounding peaks, Thorne explained with obvious pride. The valley maintains its own microclimate, warmer in winter, cooler in summer, with growing seasons extended by natural thermal springs that moderate temperature fluctuations. As they descended into the valley proper, Catherine began to notice evidence of Thorne's systematic development efforts. Trails had been carefully laid out to provide access to different timber stands without damaging the forest ecosystem. Selective cutting had opened up areas for new growth while preserving the largest and most valuable trees. Most impressive was a narrow-gauge railway system that wound through the valley, its tracks disappearing into the surrounding forest. "You built that railroad?" Catherine asked, amazed by the engineering accomplishment. "Necessity," Thorne replied. "Moving large timber out of this valley by wagon would require road construction that would destroy much of what makes the forest valuable. The railway allows precision harvesting with minimal environmental impact." Near the center of the valley stood a substantial cabin that managed to appear both rustic and sophisticated. Built from local timber and stone, it featured large windows that captured natural light and a wraparound porch that provided panoramic views of the surrounding landscape. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Catherine could see evidence of careful landscaping that enhanced rather than competed with the natural beauty. "Your home is beautiful," Catherine said as they approached the cabin. "Thomas was right about this being an exceptional opportunity." Thorne's expression softened slightly at the compliment. 6 years of work to reach this point, another 2 or 3 years to fully develop the timber operations potential. Inside the cabin, Catherine discovered that Thorne's sophistication extended far beyond engineering and forestry. The main room combined practical furniture with books, maps, and scientific instruments that suggested broad intellectual interests. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, while large windows filled the space with natural light that illuminated hand-drawn technical diagrams covering everything from timber processing to railroad engineering. "Coffee," Thorne offered, moving to a kitchen area that managed to be both primitive and efficient. "Please," Catherine accepted gratefully, using the opportunity to study her surroundings more closely. The cabin's furnishings were handcrafted, but showed remarkable attention to both function and aesthetics. Everything suggested someone who valued quality over quantity and had the skills to create what he needed rather than depending on outside sources. "Now," Thorne said, setting steaming cups on a table positioned to take advantage of the valley view, "let me show you exactly what Thomas was interested in and what kind of partnership would make sense for both of us." He spread out detailed maps and business projections that revealed the full scope of his operation. The valley contained timber resources worth tens of thousands of dollars if properly harvested and marketed. The narrow-gauge railway could transport finished lumber to a connection point with existing territorial roads, making large-scale commercial operation feasible. Most importantly, the valley's unique growing conditions meant that timber harvested sustainably would regenerate faster than in typical mountain forests. The railroad contracts Thomas secured require delivery of specific lumber types on precise schedules, Thorne explained, pointing to correspondence he had apparently maintained with Thomas before his death. Standard timber operations would struggle to meet both the quality and quantity requirements, but this valley's resources are ideally suited to those specifications. Catherine studied the projections, her seamstress background having taught her to read complex specifications carefully. "These profit estimates seem almost too good to be true. They're conservative," Thorne assured her, "based on current market prices for premium lumber delivered to railroad construction sites. The territorial railroad expansion will continue for at least 5 years, and demand for high-quality timber is growing faster than supply from traditional sources." The business case was compelling, but Catherine had learned to examine more than just financial projections. What would partnership terms look like? Thorne had clearly anticipated this question. Equal ownership of the combined operation. You bring the railroad contracts, establish transportation connections, and initial capital for expanded processing equipment. I bring the timber resources, processing expertise, and infrastructure already in place. And living arrangements? Separate. Residences? Thorne replied without hesitation. I can construct an additional cabin within a month, positioned to provide privacy while maintaining reasonable proximity for business coordination. Catherine appreciated his immediate attention to propriety concerns. What about territorial regulations regarding unmarried partnerships? Already researched. Partnership agreements between unmarried individuals are recognized under territorial law provided they're properly documented and registered. Gender isn't specified as a limiting factor in business relationships. The thoroughness of his preparation impressed Catherine almost as much as the valley's resources. This wasn't a casual proposal based on desperate circumstances. It was a carefully considered business arrangement that happened to offer solutions to both their needs. Mr. Thorne, Catherine said carefully, may I ask why you've remained isolated in this valley rather than developing commercial relationships that would have allowed you to market your timber resources independently? For the first time since they had met, Thorne's controlled composure wavered slightly. Personal reasons that made maintaining low visibility advisable, he said finally. Thomas's contracts provide a legitimate business framework that would allow commercial operation without attracting unwanted attention. Catherine sensed there was more to this explanation, but she also recognized that everyone came to the territorial frontier carrying some kind of past they preferred to leave unexamined. Her own reasons for accepting Thomas's marriage proposal had included a desire to escape the limited options available to unmarried women in Philadelphia society. Would those personal reasons affect our potential partnership? No, Thorne replied firmly. My concerns relate to maintaining privacy, not avoiding legitimate business obligations. As the afternoon progressed, Thorne guided Catherine through the valley to examine the timber resources and processing facilities firsthand. The quality of the available lumber exceeded even his conservative descriptions. Straight-grained hardwoods that would command premium prices, processed with equipment that Thorne had designed and built himself to exceed standard territorial specifications. The railway system can transport finished lumber to the territorial road connection in half-day trips, he explained, as they rode the narrow tracks in a small cart he had constructed for inspecting the operation. From there, existing transportation networks can deliver to railroad construction sites throughout the territory. Catherine found herself increasingly impressed not just by the resources, but by the systematic approach Thorne had taken to developing them. Every aspect of the operation had been planned to minimize waste while maximizing both efficiency and sustainability. Thomas was right about this being exceptional, she admitted, as they returned to the cabin in late afternoon. The question is whether I have the courage to commit to something this ambitious. Thorne studied her expression carefully. What would it take for you to feel confident about the decision? Honest assessment of the risks alongside the opportunities, Catherine replied, and understanding what failure would mean for both of us. Fair enough. Thorne settled into a chair on the cabin's porch, his gaze sweeping across the valley that represented years of solitary work. Risks include market changes that could reduce demand for premium lumber, transportation difficulties that could delay contract fulfillment, and the possibility that working in partnership might not suit either of our temperaments. And failure. For you, it would mean losing both the timber operation and Thomas's contracts, probably resulting in financial difficulties that would force you to accept whatever employment you could find in territorial towns. For me, it would mean returning to small-scale individual operation and abandoning plans for commercial development. Catherine appreciated his directness, even as the stakes he described sobered her assessment of the opportunity. How long would I have to decide? The railroad contracts specify delivery schedules beginning in 8 weeks, Thorne replied. We'd need to begin commercial production within a month to meet those deadlines, which means partnership decisions need to be made within the next few days. As evening approached and they prepared for the return journey to Copper Falls, Catherine found herself torn between excitement about the valley's potential and anxiety about committing to such a dramatic change in her life's direction. Partnership with Daniel Thorne would mean abandoning any possibility of returning to familiar Eastern society in favor of building something entirely new in the Montana wilderness. But as she looked across the hidden valley one final time before entering the narrow passage that would return them to the outside world, Catherine realized that her uncertainty wasn't about whether the opportunity was worth pursuing. It was about whether she possessed the courage to embrace the kind of future that Thomas Crawford had envisioned when he chose to build his life in this remarkable place. The return journey to Copper Falls would give her time to consider all the factors involved in the decision. But deep in her heart, Catherine was beginning to suspect that her choice had already been made the moment she first glimpsed the hidden valley and understood what it could become with the right combination of vision, determination, and partnership. And thus, ride back to Copper Falls passed in contemplative silence, broken only by the steady rhythm of hooves on mountain trails and the occasional call of evening birds settling into their roosts. Catherine found herself stealing glances at Daniel Thorne as he guided them expertly through passages that seemed invisible until they were upon them. The man beside her represented far more than she had initially suspected, not just a potential business partner, but someone whose vision and capabilities could transform her inherited responsibilities into something extraordinary. By the time they reached the outskirts of town, darkness had settled over the valley and lamplight flickered in windows throughout Copper Falls. The familiar sights felt strangely distant after a day in Thorne's hidden sanctuary, as if she had returned from another world where different rules applied and greater possibilities existed. "Miss Whitmore," Thorne said as they approached the livery stable, "I realize this decision represents a significant change from anything you might have anticipated when you traveled west. Take whatever time you need to consider all aspects of the arrangement." Catherine dismounted from Copper, surprised by how natural the motion had become after a day in the saddle. "How long can you wait for an answer?" 3 days would allow us to begin timber processing in time to meet the first railroad delivery schedule. Beyond that, we'd be looking at penalty clauses and potential contract cancellations. The time constraint added pressure to an already weighty decision, but Catherine appreciated Thorne's honesty about the business realities involved. "I'll have an answer for you by tomorrow evening," Thorne nodded, touching the brim of his hat in his characteristic gesture of respect. "Whatever you decide, today's journey has been worthwhile. Thomas would have been pleased to know his vision was shared by someone with both the courage to explore it and the wisdom to evaluate it carefully." With that, he rode away into the darkness, leaving Catherine standing outside the boarding house with her mind churning through everything she had experienced in the hidden valley. Mrs. Patterson met her at the door with obvious relief. "Thank heavens you're back safely. How did your mountain expedition proceed?" "Beyond anything I could have imagined," Catherine replied honestly, "but also more complicated than I had anticipated." Over a late supper in the boarding house kitchen, Catherine found herself struggling to describe the day's experiences to Mrs. Patterson. How could she convey the impact of discovering a place where engineering ingenuity had unlocked natural resources of extraordinary value? How could she explain the strange sense of rightness she had felt while discussing business plans with a man who combined wilderness expertise with sophisticated commercial understanding? "You're glowing," Mrs. Patterson observed, after Catherine had attempted to summarize the valley's timber resources and Thorne's development work. like someone who's discovered something that matches dreams they didn't know they were carrying. Is it that obvious? Obvious enough. The question is whether you're prepared to act on whatever inspiration that valley and its owner have provided. Catherine retired to her room with her head full of calculations and her heart full of unfamiliar emotions. She spread Thomas's business documents across her desk alongside the notes she had taken during Thorne's presentation, trying to evaluate the partnership proposal with the same methodical approach she had once applied to complex sewing projects. The financial projections were compelling. Conservative estimates suggested profits that would exceed anything she could have achieved through alternative uses of her inheritance. The timeline was tight, but manageable if Thorne's assessments of his processing capabilities were accurate. Most importantly, the sustainable approach to timber harvesting meant the operation could provide long-term prosperity rather than simply extracting resources until they were exhausted. But the decision involved more than business considerations. Partnership with Daniel Thorne would mean committing to a life in the Montana wilderness, far from the social structures and cultural refinements she had known in Philadelphia. It would mean trusting her future to a man whose past remained largely mysterious and whose character she knew only through limited interaction. Yet as Catherine reviewed her options, she realized that every alternative felt like settling for less than what was possible. Selling to Caldwell's Development Corporation would provide immediate financial security, but would abandon Thomas's vision and eliminate any chance of building something meaningful. Attempting to operate the timber business through conventional partnerships would mean surrendering control to people who might not share her commitment to sustainable practices and fair treatment of workers. A soft knock at her door interrupted these reflections. "Catherine?" Mrs. Patterson's voice carried a note of concern. "There's someone downstairs asking to speak with you. Says it's urgent business regarding your timber operation." Catherine glanced at the clock on her desk. Nearly 10 in the evening, an unusual time for business calls in a frontier town. She descended to the parlor to find Harrison Caldwell waiting with barely concealed impatience, his earlier polish replaced by something approaching desperation. "Miss Whitmore," he said, rising quickly from his chair, "I apologize for the late hour, but circumstances have made urgent communication necessary." "What kind of circumstances, Mr. Caldwell?" "My company has received information suggesting you're considering partnership arrangements that could significantly complicate the business environment in this region. I'm here to offer revised terms that might make immediate sale more attractive than prolonged commercial entanglements." Catherine maintained her composure despite the implied threat in his words. "I'm not sure what you mean by complications, Mr. Caldwell. Partnership with certain individuals can draw unwanted attention from territorial authorities," Caldwell replied carefully. "My company's research suggests that your potential partner may have legal complications that could affect any business arrangements involving him." The insinuation sent a chill through Catherine's chest. "Are you making specific accusations, Mr. Caldwell?" "I'm offering friendly advice based on information my company considers reliable. Daniel Thorne isn't the simple mountain man he appears to be, and association with him could jeopardize more than just your timber operation." Catherine studied Caldwell's face, noting the calculated way he delivered these warnings. "Mr. Caldwell, are you suggesting that I should make business decisions based on unspecified rumors about a man's past?" "I'm suggesting that $1,200 cash today might be preferable to potential legal difficulties tomorrow," Caldwell replied, his tone hardening slightly. "My company is prepared to finalize the purchase tonight, eliminating any risks associated with prolonged territorial involvement." The increased offer confirmed Catherine's suspicion that her inheritance was worth far more than Caldwell had initially indicated. "That's quite an increase from your previous offer, Mr. Caldwell. What prompted such generosity?" Market conditions change rapidly in territorial business, he replied evasively. My company prefers to secure valuable properties before they become entangled in complications that could reduce their value. Catherine rose from her chair, her decision crystallizing with sudden clarity. Mr. Caldwell, I appreciate your concern for my welfare, but I'm not interested in selling my timber operation at any price. Good evening. Caldwell's mask of professional courtesy slipped completely. Miss Whitmore, you're making a serious mistake. My company has resources and connections that could make operating a timber business very difficult for someone who chooses the wrong associates. Are you threatening me, Mr. Caldwell? I'm warning you about the realities of territorial business that Eastern ladies often fail to understand until it's too late. Mrs. Patterson appeared in the parlor doorway with perfect timing. Mr. Caldwell, visiting hours at my establishment end at 9 o'clock. I'll have to ask you to continue this conversation at a more appropriate time. After Caldwell departed with obvious reluctance, Catherine found herself more convinced than ever that partnership with Daniel Thorne represented the right choice. Whatever past complications might exist in Thorne's background, they couldn't be worse than the present threats, represented by Caldwell's aggressive tactics. That man gives me the shivers, Mrs. Patterson observed after securing the front door. Too slick for honest business and too desperate for someone with legitimate authority. Catherine spent a restless night weighing final considerations about the partnership decision. Caldwell's warnings about Thorne's past might represent genuine concerns or might simply be tactics designed to pressure her into selling. Either way, they didn't change the fundamental merits of the business opportunity or her assessment of Thorne's character based on direct interaction. Morning brought unexpected developments when Judge Morrison arrived at the boarding house with news that would affect Catherine's decision in ways she hadn't anticipated. Miss Whitmore, he said, accepting Mrs. Patterson's offer of coffee in the dining room, I've received some interesting information about your visitor last evening. Harrison Caldwell. The same. I took the liberty of telegraphing colleagues in Helena about the Territorial Development Corporation after our conversation about their buyout offer. The responses were illuminating. Judge Morrison withdrew a folder from his briefcase and spread several documents across the table. The Territorial Development Corporation exists, but it's a front organization for Eastern mining and lumber interests that specialize in acquiring territorial properties at below-market prices for resale to larger operations. Catherine studied the telegraph responses and official documents the judge had collected. They're not interested in developing the properties themselves. Quite the opposite. They acquire properties from individuals who lack the resources or expertise to develop them properly, then sell them to established companies at substantial profits. In some cases, they've used questionable tactics to pressure property owners into selling. What kind of questionable tactics? Intimidation, false information about legal complications, even sabotage of existing operations to reduce their value before purchase. Judge Morrison's expression grew serious. Miss Whitmore, I believe Mr. Caldwell's warnings about your potential partner may represent the kind of false information designed to manipulate your business decisions. This revelation cast Caldwell's behavior in an entirely new light. His escalating offers and dire warnings weren't motivated by concern for Catherine's welfare. They were desperate attempts to acquire valuable property before she could develop it successfully. Judge Morrison, Catherine said carefully, what would you recommend regarding partnership arrangements with someone whose past might include complications? In the territorial frontier, most successful individuals carry some kind of complicated past, the judge replied pragmatically. The relevant questions are whether someone conducts current business honestly and whether they honor their commitments. Character matters more than history in building sustainable relationships. Armed with this perspective, Catherine felt the last of her uncertainty dissolve. Whatever Daniel Thorne's reasons for seeking privacy in his hidden valley, his business proposal was both honest and mutually beneficial. His development work demonstrated exactly the kind of long-term thinking and environmental responsibility that Thomas Crawford had valued in his own planning. That afternoon, Catherine asked Tommy Brennan to guide her to the location where Thorne had said he would be working if she decided to accept the partnership. They found him at a timber processing site near the valley entrance, operating machinery he had clearly designed himself for maximum efficiency with minimal environmental impact. "Mr. Thorne," Catherine called as they approached, "I have an answer to your partnership proposal." Thorne shut down the equipment and walked toward them, his expression carefully neutral despite what must have been considerable anxiety about her decision. "I accept," Catherine said simply. "Equal partnership, separate residences, and shared commitment to fulfilling Thomas's vision for sustainable timber operations." For a moment, Thorne's controlled composure wavered completely, revealing genuine relief and something that might have been joy. "You're certain about this decision?" "More certain than I've been about anything since leaving Philadelphia," Catherine replied. "When do we begin?" "Immediately," Thorne said, his business focus returning quickly. "We'll need to formalize the partnership legally, arrange for your relocation to the valley, and begin commercial timber processing within 2 weeks to meet the first railroad delivery schedule." As they discussed practical arrangements for launching their joint operation, Catherine felt a sense of rightness that went beyond mere business considerations. She was embarking on exactly the kind of adventure that had drawn her west in the first place, the chance to build something meaningful, alongside someone who shared her values and ambitions. The partnership with Daniel Thorne wouldn't just preserve Thomas Crawford's legacy, it would transform it into something even more substantial than the original vision. In choosing to trust her future to this mysterious mountain man and his extraordinary valley, Catherine was also choosing to trust herself to rise to challenges that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. But as they shook hands to seal their agreement, Catherine couldn't entirely shake the memory of Caldwell's warnings about complications that might await anyone who chose to build a life with Daniel Thorne in the remote Montana wilderness. Some secrets she was beginning to understand cast shadows that could reach even into hidden valleys where new beginnings seemed possible. Nevertheless, her decision was made, and Catherine Whitmore was ready to discover what kind of future could be built when courage met opportunity in the vast spaces of the American frontier. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them as an equal partner rather than a dependent victim of circumstances beyond her control. The partnership agreement was formalized 2 days later in Judge Morrison's makeshift courthouse, with Mrs. Patterson and Tommy Brennan serving as witnesses to the document that would legally bind Catherine's future to Daniel Thorne's timber operation. The paperwork was thorough, establishing not only business arrangements but also protocols for dispute resolution, profit distribution, and operational decision-making that spoke to both parties' understanding of how easily good intentions could be undermined by unclear expectations. "I've never seen a more comprehensive partnership agreement drafted in territorial proceedings," Judge Morrison observed as he applied the official seal. "You've both clearly given considerable thought to potential complications." Catherine signed her name with a steady hand, surprised by how natural the commitment felt despite its magnitude. Beside her, Thorne's signature revealed the same careful precision that characterized everything else about his approach to business. "And life, when do you plan to relocate to the valley?" the judge asked as they concluded the legal formalities. "Tomorrow," Catherine replied, earning a surprised glance from Mrs. Patterson. Mr. Thorne has completed construction of my cabin, and we need to begin timber processing immediately to meet our first delivery deadline. The speed of her transition from uncertain inheritance recipient to committed business partner would have shocked Catherine, who had arrived in Copper Falls just weeks earlier. But necessity had taught her that survival in the frontier required quick adaptation to changing circumstances, and opportunity demanded action rather than prolonged deliberation. That evening, Catherine packed her belongings for the move to Thorne's Valley, keeping only what would be practical for mountain life, while storing her Philadelphia finery with Mrs. Patterson for an uncertain future need. The transformation felt symbolic. She was literally shedding the trappings of her Eastern existence in favor of tools and clothing suited to building something entirely new. "You'll always have a room here if you need it," Mrs. Patterson assured her, as they folded Catherine's more delicate dresses into a cedar chest. Mountain partnerships can be challenging, and it's wise to maintain connections to the outside world. Catherine appreciated the concern behind the offer, even as she recognized her own commitment to making the partnership succeed. "Mrs. Patterson, may I ask you something personal?" "Of course, dear. When you decided to remain in Copper Falls, after your husband died, instead of returning east to your family, what convinced you that building a new life here was preferable to resuming your old one?" Mrs. Patterson paused in her folding, her expression growing thoughtful. "I suppose it was recognizing that the woman who had traveled west with Henry was no longer the same person who might have returned to Ohio. The frontier changes you in ways that make it impossible to fit back into spaces you've outgrown." The observation resonated deeply with Catherine's own experience. The seamstress, who had boarded a train in Philadelphia carrying romantic dreams about mail-order marriage, bore little resemblance to the woman now preparing to operate a timber business. In partnership with a mountain engineer, she had discovered capabilities and appetites for challenge that would have remained dormant in the constrained environment of Eastern society. Dawn brought Daniel Thorne to the boarding house with a pack train of 3 mules loaded with supplies for establishing Catherine's household in the valley. His efficiency in arranging the logistics of her relocation demonstrated the same systematic approach he applied to all aspects of business operations. "Your cabin is positioned to provide both privacy and easy access to the timber processing facilities," he explained, as they loaded Catherine's belongings onto the lead mule. "I've included furniture and household supplies, but if you need anything specific, we can arrange supply runs to town as necessary." The journey to the Hidden Valley took on different significance now that Catherine was traveling, not as a visitor evaluating an opportunity, but as a partner claiming her place in an established operation. She found herself studying the landscape with new eyes, seeing it not just as spectacular scenery, but as the environment that would shape her daily life for the foreseeable future. "The processing schedule I've planned requires us to work closely together for the first several weeks," Thorne said as they navigated the familiar trail toward the hidden entrance. "After that, once you're comfortable with the operational procedures, we can establish more independent routines." Catherine appreciated his recognition that she would need time to learn the technical aspects of timber operations while also establishing her own domestic arrangements. "What should I focus on learning first? Quality assessment and customer specifications," Thorne replied immediately. "Railroad contracts include precise requirements for lumber dimensions, wood density, and finish. Quality. Understanding those standards will allow you to participate meaningfully in production decisions." The Hidden Valley appeared even more spectacular during her second visit, perhaps because Catherine now saw it as home rather than simply an impressive natural wonder. The cabin Thorne had constructed for her occupied a slight rise that provided panoramic views while maintaining reasonable proximity to both his residence and the timber processing facilities. "It's perfect," Catherine breathed as they approached the new structure. Built from the same high-quality timber that would form the basis of their commercial operation, the cabin featured large windows, a covered porch, and interior spaces designed for both comfort and functionality. Inside, Catherine found that Thorne had anticipated her needs with remarkable accuracy. The furniture was handcrafted but elegant. The kitchen was equipped for serious cooking, and a small office area provided space for managing the business correspondence that would be part of her partnership responsibilities. "You've thought of everything," she said, genuinely moved by the care he had taken in preparing for her arrival. "I wanted you to feel settled quickly so we could focus our energy on timber operations rather than household arrangements," Thorne replied. But Catherine detected something beyond mere practical consideration in his attention to her comfort. The first week of their partnership established routines that would govern their working relationship. Each morning, they met at the processing facility to review production schedules and quality requirements for their current orders. Catherine proved remarkably adept at learning the technical aspects of lumber grading, while her background in precise needlework translated unexpectedly well to understanding the exacting standards required for railroad construction materials. "Your eye for detail is exceptional," Thorne observed, after Catherine correctly identified a subtle wood grain variation that would affect structural integrity. "Most people require months to develop that level of quality assessment skill." Working closely together revealed complementary strengths that enhanced their operational efficiency. Thorne's engineering expertise and mechanical innovations provided the foundation for high-quality production, while Catherine's organizational skills and business correspondence experience streamlined customer relations and order management. But the partnership also created unexpected personal dynamics that neither had fully anticipated. Spending entire days collaborating on complex projects fostered a familiarity that went beyond professional interaction, revealing shared values and compatible approaches to problem-solving that suggested deeper compatibility. "You've been remarkably patient with my questions about timber processing," Catherine said one evening as they reviewed the day's production records on her cabin porch. "I know this partnership requires you to share knowledge you've spent years developing independently." Thorne was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the valley vista as twilight settled over the mountains. "Sharing knowledge makes it more valuable, not less," he said finally. Thomas understood that. It's why he was interested in partnership, rather than simply purchasing timber for his contracts. The mention of Thomas had become less painful for Catherine as she grew to understand how her inherited opportunities were being transformed into something that honored his vision while exceeding his original plans. The timber operation was prospering beyond even Thorne's conservative projections, with quality control that earned premium prices and delivery schedules that established their reputation for reliability. 3 weeks into their partnership, however, external pressures began to threaten their carefully established routines. Tommy Brennan arrived at the valley with news that cast shadows over their commercial success. "There's been strangers asking questions around town," he reported during a supply delivery. "Folks claiming to be territorial investigators looking into business license compliance. But they're asking specifically about this operation and about Mr. Thorne's background." Catherine felt a chill of recognition. What kind of questions? Legal. Status of partnerships between unmarried persons, compliance with territorial business regulations, and something about previous employment records for property owners. Tommy's expression grew troubled. "Miss Catherine, these fellows don't act like official investigators, more like private agents working for someone with particular interests. Thorne's jaw tightened, but his voice remained controlled. Caldwell's company, most likely. They're escalating pressure since direct purchase offers failed. Can they cause actual legal difficulties? Catherine asked, concerned about threats to everything they had built. Depends on what they're willing to fabricate, Thorne replied grimly. Territorial law is still evolving, and enforcement is inconsistent. Determined opposition with sufficient resources can create problems even for legitimate operations. That evening, Catherine and Thorne held their first serious discussion about the complications his past might bring to their partnership. She had sensed from their initial meeting that he carried secrets, but the success of their business collaboration had made those concerns seem irrelevant to their present circumstances. I need to know what we might be facing, Catherine said directly. If these investigators represent a genuine threat to our operation, I deserve to understand the nature of that threat. Thorne was silent for a long time, staring into the fire that warmed her cabin's main room. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of carefully guarded memories. I worked railroad construction in Colorado before coming to Montana, he began slowly. Engineering projects for a company that was later discovered to be embezzling federal funds allocated for territorial development. When the investigation began, several employees disappeared rather than face questioning about their knowledge of the financial irregularities. Catherine absorbed this information, understanding now why Thorne had sought isolation in a hidden valley. Were you involved in the embezzlement? No, Thorne replied firmly, but I had access to engineering records that would have revealed the scope of the fraudulent activities. Leaving Colorado seemed preferable to becoming entangled in legal proceedings that could have dragged on for years. And now someone is investigating your background? If Caldwell's company is as unscrupulous as Judge Morrison suggested, they might attempt to use my past to create legal complications for our partnership. Even unfounded accusations could disrupt our business operations while we defended against them. Catherine considered this carefully. The partnership had already proven its value. They were fulfilling Thomas's contracts profitably while building a sustainable operation that could provide long-term prosperity. The threats Thorne described were serious, but they represented risks to be managed rather than reasons to abandon a successful enterprise. What would it take to resolve these complications permanently? She asked. Thorne looked surprised by her question. Why would you want to involve yourself in legal difficulties that aren't your responsibility? Because they threaten our partnership, which makes them my concern, Catherine replied simply. If there are ways to address your past legal status, perhaps we should explore them, rather than simply hoping these problems disappear. Over the following days, Catherine took the initiative in developing a strategy for protecting their operation against external threats. She wrote to Judge Morrison, requesting advice about territorial legal procedures for resolving outstanding warrant concerns. She also began documenting their business operations with meticulous attention to regulatory compliance, ensuring that any official investigation would find their partnership beyond reproach. You don't need to take these risks for me, Thorne protested when he discovered the extent of her efforts on his behalf. I'm not taking them for you, Catherine corrected. I'm taking them for us and for the future we're building together. The distinction mattered more than either of them had anticipated. What had begun as a practical business arrangement was evolving into something deeper, a genuine partnership based on shared values, mutual respect, and growing personal attachment that neither had expected when they first shook hands over Thomas Crawford's business documents. But as autumn approached and their first major contract deadline loomed, Catherine and Daniel Thorne would discover that some threats couldn't be resolved through documentation and legal compliance. The enemies they had made were prepared to escalate their attacks in ways that would test not only their business partnership, but their personal commitment to building a life together in the hidden valley that had become home for both of them. Challenges ahead would require more than business acumen and engineering expertise. They would demand the kind of courage that came only from knowing that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the personal cost involved in defending them. The first snow of autumn arrived earlier than expected, dusting the peaks surrounding. The hidden valley with pristine white that made the protected landscape seem even more magical by contrast. Catherine woke to find frost on her cabin windows, but the valley floor remained green and warm, thanks to the thermal springs that moderated the microclimate Daniel had described during her first visit. She was preparing breakfast when urgent. Hoofbeats echoed through the morning stillness. From her kitchen window, Catherine could see a rider approaching at dangerous speed along the narrow railway tracks, the only route that allowed rapid transit through the valley's dense forest. As the figure drew closer, she recognized Tommy Brennan, his face grim with the kind of news that couldn't wait for normal supply deliveries. "Miss Catherine," Tommy called as he dismounted near her porch. "We've got serious trouble brewing in town. Those investigators, they ain't investigators at all." Catherine quickly poured coffee for the obviously exhausted young man. "What do you mean?" "Turns out they're private agents working for some Eastern mining consortium," Tommy explained between grateful sips of the hot beverage. "Judge Morrison did some telegraphing to his contacts in Helena, and these fellows have no official standing whatsoever. They've been spreading stories about Mr. Thorne being a wanted fugitive and your partnership being some kind of criminal conspiracy." The accusations were exactly what Catherine had feared since learning about Daniel's complicated past. "How much damage have they done?" "Enough that some folks in town are starting to question whether they should be doing business with your operation," Tommy replied reluctantly. "Nothing official yet, but Mrs. Patterson says there's talk about investigating your timber contracts for compliance with territorial partnership laws." Catherine felt a surge of anger at the injustice of attacks based on deliberately distorted information. "Where's Mr. Thorne?" "Down at the processing site, working on that big railroad order that's due next week. I came here first because I figured you'd want to know before these rumors spread any further." Catherine grabbed her coat and headed immediately for the timber processing facility where Daniel worked with focused intensity that suggested he was using physical labor to manage stress. The sound of machinery filled the air as he operated the specialized equipment he had designed for precision lumber cutting. "Daniel," she called over the noise, and he immediately shut down the equipment and turned toward her with an expression that confirmed he sensed trouble. "Tommy brought news from town," Catherine continued. "The situation is escalating beyond what we anticipated." After Tommy repeated his report about the false investigators and spreading rumors, Daniel's face grew, dark with anger and frustration. "I should have anticipated this level of systematic attack," he said grimly. "Caldwell's people are playing for higher stakes than I realized." "What exactly are they hoping to accomplish?" Catherine asked. "Force us into a position where we can't. Fulfill our contracts, creating default situations that would allow them to acquire the timber rights for a fraction of their value," Daniel replied. "If they can discredit our operations sufficiently, the railroad companies might cancel our agreements rather than risk association with supposedly fraudulent partnerships." The elegant viciousness of the strategy became clear to Catherine as she considered its implications. Their enemies didn't need to prove actual wrongdoing. They only needed to create enough doubt about the partnership's legitimacy to undermine business relationships that depended on trust and reliability. "How long before this affects our current?" "A contract?" she asked. "Probably days rather than weeks," Daniel admitted. "Railroad purchasing agents are cautious about suppliers who attract legal attention, even if the accusations prove unfounded." Catherine felt her determination crystallizing into a plan of action that would either resolve their problems permanently or destroy everything they had built together. Daniel, what would it take to clear your name completely? Not just for this situation, but for the Colorado complications that started all of this. Daniel looked surprised by the scope of her question. Why would you want to pursue something that complex? Because running from problems doesn't solve them. It only postpones the day when they have to be faced, Catherine replied firmly. We've built something valuable here, and I'm not willing to lose it because we're afraid to fight for what's rightfully ours. Over the next several hours, Catherine and Daniel developed a strategy that would require courage, resources, and considerable faith in the territorial legal system's capacity for justice. Rather than waiting for their enemies to destroy their reputation through rumors and false accusations, they would take the offensive by addressing the underlying legal complications directly. I'll travel to Helena and arrange for legal representation. Regarding the Colorado warrant situation, Catherine announced, Judge Morrison has contacts there who can help us understand exactly what evidence would be required to clear your name permanently. Catherine, that's an unnecessary risk, Daniel protested. This fight isn't your responsibility. This partnership is my responsibility, she corrected. Everything we've accomplished here is worth defending, and I won't abandon it without exhausting every possible solution. Daniel studied her face for a long moment, clearly recognizing that her mind was made up despite the dangers involved. If you're determined to pursue this approach, we should do it properly. I'll accompany you to Helena and face whatever legal proceedings are necessary. You're willing to risk arrest? I'm willing to risk arrest to end this situation permanently, Daniel replied. 6 years of hiding hasn't resolved anything. Perhaps it's time to trust that the truth can defend itself if presented properly. They spent the afternoon making arrangements for their absence from the valley. The timber processing schedule would have to be suspended temporarily, but their current inventory was sufficient to fulfill immediate delivery commitments. More importantly, they drafted detailed documentation of their business operations, financial records, and customer relationships to demonstrate the legitimate nature of their partnership. Tommy, Catherine said as they prepared for departure the following morning, we need someone in town who can counter the rumors being spread about our operation. Are you willing to speak truthfully about what you've observed during your visits to our valley? Absolutely, Tommy replied without hesitation. Anyone who's seen what you two have built up here knows it's honest work producing quality goods. I'll make sure folks hear that side of the story. The journey to Helena took 3 days through increasingly difficult weather as autumn storms moved through the mountain passes. Catherine found herself grateful for the wilderness skills Daniel had helped her develop during their months of partnership. Abilities that would have been unimaginable during her Philadelphia days, but now felt natural and necessary. Helena proved to be a genuine city compared to the frontier settlements Catherine had grown accustomed to, with paved streets, substantial buildings, and the kind of social infrastructure that suggested permanent rather than temporary civilization. The territorial courthouse occupied an impressive stone building that spoke to the region's growing political maturity. Judge Morrison's colleague, a territorial prosecutor named William Hayes, reviewed Daniel's situation with the thorough attention of someone who understood both legal complexities and political realities. The Colorado warrant was issued for questioning rather than formal charges, he explained after examining the relevant documents. With proper legal representation and evidence of current legitimate business activities, resolution should be achievable. What kind of evidence? Catherine asked. Documentation of your timber operations compliance with territorial business regulations, customer testimonials regarding the quality and reliability of your services, and character references from established community members, Hayes replied. "The goal is to demonstrate that Mr. Thorne has been conducting legitimate business rather than hiding from legal responsibilities." The legal proceedings stretched over 2 weeks as Hayes coordinated with Colorado authorities to arrange Daniel's voluntary appearance before the investigating commission. Catherine used this time to gather the supporting documentation needed to present Daniel's case in the most favorable light possible. The character references proved particularly valuable. Judge Morrison provided a detailed letter describing Daniel's business conduct and community standing. Mrs. Patterson wrote eloquently about his respectful behavior and obvious integrity during his interactions with Copper Falls residents. Most surprisingly, several railroad purchasing agents submitted testimonials praising the exceptional quality of lumber delivered under their partnership contracts. "Your business reputation is remarkably strong for such a short operational period," Hayes observed as he reviewed the accumulated evidence. "These testimonials suggest customer satisfaction that goes well beyond mere contract compliance." When Daniel finally appeared before the Colorado Investigating Commission via territorial legal procedures, the proceedings lasted only a single day. The commissioners were primarily interested in confirming that he possessed no knowledge of financial irregularities beyond what had already been documented through other witnesses. His engineering records actually helped clarify the timeline of fraudulent activities, providing evidence that supported the prosecution's case against the actual perpetrators. "The warrant for questioning is hereby dissolved," the commission chairman announced after deliberating for less than an hour. "Mr. Thorne's testimony has been valuable to our investigation, and there are no outstanding legal issues requiring further proceedings." Catherine felt a tremendous weight lift from her shoulders as Daniel emerged from the courthouse, a completely free man for the first time in 6 years. The legal vindication meant more than just personal relief. It eliminated the leverage their enemies had been using to threaten their business operations, but their triumph was tempered by urgent news waiting for them at their Helena hotel. A telegram from Tommy Brennan brought word that Caldwell's agents had escalated their attacks during Daniel and Catherine's absence, spreading rumors that their departure represented flight from territorial authorities and abandonment of existing business commitments. "We need to return immediately," Daniel said after reading the telegram. "Every day we're absent gives them more time to damage our reputation and business relationships." The return journey to Copper Falls became a race against time as they hurried to counter the false narratives being spread about their operation. But Catherine felt confident that the legal vindication they carried would provide decisive evidence against their accusers' credibility. They arrived in Copper Falls to find the town divided between those who believed the rumors being spread by Caldwell's agents and those who trusted their own observations of the partnership's legitimate operations. Mrs. Patterson met them at the boarding house with relief and concern. "Thank heavens you're back safely," she said, embracing Catherine warmly. "These past 2 weeks have been a trial, with strangers asking invasive questions and spreading tales that make no sense to anyone who actually knows you." Judge Morrison arrived within an hour of their return, eager to learn the results of their legal proceedings. When Daniel presented the official documents clearing his name of any criminal complications, the judge's satisfaction was evident. "This changes everything," Morrison declared. "Caldwell's agents have been using your supposed fugitive status as the basis for all their accusations about fraudulent business practices. With that foundation removed, their entire campaign collapses." The next morning brought the confrontation Catherine had been anticipating since first encountering Harrison Caldwell's aggressive tactics. The businessman arrived at the courthouse with 2 associates, clearly expecting to find their adversaries either fled or arrested based on the rumors his agents had been spreading. Instead, he found Daniel and Catherine waiting with Judge Morrison and a court reporter, prepared to address his accusations through formal legal proceedings rather than whispered rumors. "Mr. Caldwell," Judge Morrison began formally, "you've made serious allegations about fraudulent business practices and criminal associations regarding the Whitmore-Thorne Timber Partnership. These individuals are here to address those accusations directly and to request that you provide evidence supporting your claims." Caldwell's confidence wavered as he realized that his opponents had chosen to fight rather than flee. "My company's investigation has revealed irregularities that raise questions about the legitimacy of this partnership and its contracts." "What specific irregularities?" Catherine asked calmly, producing the comprehensive documentation they had prepared. "Our business records show full compliance with territorial partnership regulations, customer satisfaction that exceeds contract requirements, and financial practices that have been reviewed by qualified territorial prosecutors." The legal vindication from Colorado proved decisive in dismantling Caldwell's accusations. When Daniel presented the official documents clearing his name and reputation, the foundation for all claims about criminal association disappeared completely. "It appears your investigation was based on incomplete information, Mr. Caldwell," Judge Morrison observed. "Is your company prepared to retract the allegations made against this partnership?" Caldwell's retreat was swift once he realized that his campaign had not only failed, but had exposed his own organization to potential legal action for spreading false information about legitimate business operations. Within a week, the Territorial Development Corporation withdrew all interest in acquiring the Whitmore-Thorne timber operation and departed the region entirely. The resolution of their external threats allowed Catherine and Daniel to focus their attention on the personal relationship that had been growing alongside their business partnership. The challenges they had faced together had revealed compatibility that went far beyond shared professional interests. "Catherine," Daniel said one evening as they sat on her cabin porch watching sunset paint the valley in golden light, "I need to ask you something important." She turned toward him, sensing the significance of whatever he was preparing to say. "When you accepted partnership with me, it was a business arrangement based on mutual benefit and shared goals," he continued carefully. "But somewhere along the way, this became more than business for me. I need to know if you feel the same way." Catherine felt her heart accelerate as she recognized the moment she had been both hoping for and fearing. "Yes," she said simply. "This became more than business for me too." The kiss that followed was gentle but certain, carrying the weight of shared struggles and mutual respect that had grown between them over months of working together toward common goals. When they separated, Catherine felt that the final piece of her new life had fallen into place. "Will you marry me?" Daniel asked, his voice quiet but steady. "Not as a business arrangement, but because I love you and want to build a life together that includes both personal happiness and professional partnership." "Yes," Catherine replied without hesitation. "I will marry you, Daniel Thorne, because I love you too, and because I can't imagine a future that doesn't include building something wonderful together in this valley." Their wedding took place 6 weeks later in Copper Falls, officiated by Judge Morrison, with the entire town in attendance. Mrs. Patterson had insisted on hosting the reception at her boarding house, and even Tommy Brennan appeared in his finest clothes to serve as Daniel's best man. As Catherine stood beside Daniel, exchanging vows that formalized both their personal and business partnership, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from Philadelphia to this moment. She had traveled west, seeking a predetermined future with a man she knew only through letters, but had instead discovered the courage to build something far more meaningful with a partner who valued her judgment, respected her capabilities, and shared her vision for what two people could accomplish together. The hidden valley that had once represented Daniel's refuge from complications had become their shared home and the foundation for prosperity that honored both Thomas Crawford's original vision and their own dreams for the future. The timber operation continued to flourish, providing sustainable income while maintaining the environmental stewardship that both partners considered essential. But more than financial success, Catherine had found in Daniel Thorne the kind of partnership that allowed both individuals to become more than they could have achieved separately. She had discovered capabilities and strength that would have remained dormant in the constrained environment of Eastern society, while helping Daniel find the courage to face his past and build openly toward a future that no longer required hiding. As they danced at their wedding reception, surrounded by friends who had supported them through challenges that would have broken lesser partnerships, Catherine knew with absolute certainty that she had found not just love, but the life she had been meant to live. The mail-order bride who had arrived in Montana Territory seeking security had become a pioneering businesswoman who had chosen adventure, partnership, and the kind of happiness that could only be built through courage, determination, and the willingness to trust that some gambles were worth taking regardless of the risks involved. The hidden valley that had offered Daniel's sanctuary now sheltered them both as they began building a legacy that would endure long after the mountains themselves had witnessed countless other stories of people brave enough to seek new beginnings in the vast spaces of the American frontier. The first snow of autumn arrived earlier than expected, dusting the peaks surrounding the hidden valley with pristine white that made the protected landscape seem even more magical by contrast. Catherine woke to find frost on her cabin windows, but the valley floor remained green and warm thanks to the thermal springs that moderated the microclimate Daniel had described during her first visit. She was preparing breakfast when urgent hoofbeats echoed through the morning stillness. From her kitchen window, Catherine could see a rider approaching at dangerous speed along the narrow railway tracks, the only route that allowed rapid transit through the valley's dense forest. As the figure drew closer, she recognized Tommy Brennan, his face grim with the kind of news that couldn't wait for normal supply deliveries. "Miss Catherine," Tommy called as he dismounted near her porch, "we've got serious trouble brewing in town. Those investigators, they ain't investigators at all." Catherine quickly poured coffee for the obviously exhausted young man. "What do you mean? Turns out they're private agents working for some Eastern mining consortium," Tommy explained between grateful sips of the hot beverage. "Judge Morrison did some telegraphing to his contacts in Helena, and these fellows have no official standing whatsoever. They've been spreading stories about Mr. Thorne being a wanted fugitive and your partnership being some kind of criminal conspiracy." The accusations were exactly what Catherine had feared since learning about Daniel's complicated past. How much damage have they done? Enough that some folks in town are starting to question whether they should be doing business with your operation, Tommy replied reluctantly. "Nothing official yet, but Mrs. Patterson says there's talk about investigating your timber contracts for compliance with territorial partnership laws." Catherine felt a surge of anger at the injustice of attacks based on deliberately distorted information. "Where's Mr. Thorne?" "Down at the processing site, working on that big railroad order that's due next week. I came here first because I figured you'd want to know before these rumors spread any further." Catherine grabbed her coat and headed immediately for the timber processing facility where Daniel worked with focused intensity that suggested he was using physical labor to manage stress. The sound of machinery filled the air as he operated the specialized equipment he had designed for precision lumber cutting. "Daniel!" she called over the noise, and he immediately shut down the equipment and turned toward her with an expression that confirmed he sensed trouble. "Tommy brought news from town," Catherine continued. "The situation is escalating beyond what we anticipated." After Tommy repeated his report about the false investigators and spreading rumors, Daniel's face grew, dark with anger and frustration. "I should have anticipated this level of systematic attack," he said grimly. "Caldwell's people are playing for higher stakes than I realized." "What exactly are they hoping to accomplish?" Catherine asked. "Force us into a position where we can't fulfill our contracts, creating default situations that would allow them to acquire the timber rights for a fraction of their value," Daniel replied. "If they can discredit our operations sufficiently, the railroad companies might cancel our agreements rather than risk association with supposedly fraudulent partnerships." The elegant viciousness of the strategy became clear to Catherine as she considered its implications. Their enemies didn't need to prove actual wrongdoing. They only needed to create enough doubt about the partnership's legitimacy to undermine business relationships that depended on trust and reliability. "How long before this affects our current contracts?" she asked. "Probably days rather than weeks," Daniel admitted. "Railroad purchasing agents are cautious about suppliers who attract legal attention, even if the accusations prove unfounded." Catherine felt her determination crystallizing into a plan of action that would either resolve their problems permanently or destroy everything they had built together. "Daniel, what would it take to clear your name completely? Not just for this situation, but for the Colorado complications that started all of this?" Daniel looked surprised by the scope of her question. "Why would you want to pursue something that complex?" "Because running from problems doesn't solve them. It only postpones the day when they have to be faced," Catherine replied firmly. "We've built something valuable here, and I'm not willing to lose it because we're afraid to fight for what's rightfully ours." Over the next several hours, Catherine and Daniel developed a strategy that would require courage, resources, and considerable faith in the territorial legal system's capacity for justice. Rather than waiting for their enemies to destroy their reputation through rumors and false accusations, they would take the offensive by addressing the underlying legal complications directly. "I'll travel to Helena and arrange for legal representation regarding the Colorado warrant situation," Catherine announced. "Judge Morrison has contacts there who can help us understand exactly what evidence would be required to clear your name permanently." "Catherine, that's an unnecessary risk," Daniel protested. "This fight isn't your responsibility." "This partnership is my responsibility," she corrected. "Everything we've accomplished here is worth defending, and I won't abandon it without exhausting every possible solution." Daniel studied her face for a long moment, clearly recognizing that her mind was made up despite the dangers involved. "If you're determined to pursue this approach, we should do it properly. I'll accompany you to Helena and face whatever legal proceedings are necessary. You're willing to risk arrest?" "I'm willing to risk arrest to end this situation permanently," Daniel replied. 6 years of hiding hasn't resolved anything. Perhaps it's time to trust that the truth can defend itself if presented properly. They spent the afternoon making arrangements for their absence from the valley. The timber processing schedule would have to be suspended temporarily, but their current inventory was sufficient to fulfill immediate delivery commitments. More importantly, they drafted detailed documentation of their business operations, financial records, and customer relationships to demonstrate the legitimate nature of their partnership. "Tommy," Catherine said as they prepared for departure the following morning, "we need someone in town who can counter the rumors being spread about our operation. Are you willing to speak truthfully about what you've observed during your visits?" "To our valley?" "Absolutely," Tommy replied without hesitation. "Anyone who's seen what you two have built up here knows it's honest work producing quality goods. I'll make sure folks hear that side of the story." The journey to Helena took 3 days through increasingly difficult weather as autumn storms moved through the mountain passes. Catherine found herself grateful for the wilderness skills Daniel had helped her develop during their months of partnership, abilities that would have been unimaginable during her Philadelphia days, but now felt natural and necessary. Helena proved to be a genuine city compared to the frontier settlements Catherine had grown accustomed to, with paved streets, substantial buildings, and the kind of social infrastructure that suggested permanent rather than temporary civilization. The territorial courthouse occupied an impressive stone building that spoke to the region's growing political maturity. Judge Morrison's colleague, a territorial prosecutor named William Hayes, reviewed Daniel's situation with the thorough attention of someone who understood both legal complexities and political realities. The Colorado warrant was issued for questioning rather than formal charges, he explained after examining the relevant documents. With proper legal representation and evidence of current legitimate business activities, resolution should be achievable. What kind of evidence? Catherine asked. Documentation of your timber operations' compliance with territorial business regulations, customer testimonials regarding the quality and reliability of your services, and character references from established community members, Hayes replied. The goal is to demonstrate that Mr. Thorne has been conducting legitimate business rather than hiding from legal responsibilities. The legal proceedings stretched over 2 weeks as Hayes coordinated with Colorado authorities to arrange Daniel's voluntary appearance before the investigating commission. Catherine used this time to gather the supporting documentation needed to present Daniel's case in the most favorable light possible. The character references proved particularly valuable. Judge Morrison provided a detailed letter describing Daniel's business conduct and community standing. Mrs. Patterson wrote eloquently about his respectful behavior and obvious integrity during his interactions with Copper Falls residents. Most surprisingly, several railroad purchasing agents submitted testimonials praising the exceptional quality of lumber delivered under their partnership contracts. Your business reputation is remarkably strong for such a short operational period, Hayes observed as he reviewed the accumulated evidence. These testimonials suggest customer satisfaction that goes well beyond mere contract compliance. When Daniel finally appeared before the Colorado Investigating Commission via territorial legal procedures, the proceedings lasted only a single day. The commissioners were primarily interested in confirming that he possessed no knowledge of financial irregularities beyond what had already been documented through other witnesses. His engineering records actually helped clarify the timeline of fraudulent activities, providing evidence that supported the prosecution's case against the actual perpetrators. The warrant for questioning is hereby dissolved, the commission chairman announced after deliberating for less than an hour. Mr. Thorne's testimony has been valuable to our investigation, and there are no outstanding legal issues requiring further proceedings. Catherine felt a tremendous weight lift from her shoulders as Daniel emerged from the courthouse a completely free man for the first time in 6 years. The legal vindication meant more than just personal relief. It eliminated the leverage their enemies had been using to threaten their business operations, but their triumph was tempered by urgent news waiting for them at their Helena hotel. A telegram from Tommy Brennan brought word that Caldwell's agents had escalated their attacks during Daniel and Catherine's absence, spreading rumors that their departure represented flight from territorial authorities and abandonment of existing business commitments. "We need to return immediately," Daniel said after reading the telegram. "Every day we're absent gives them more time to damage our reputation and business relationships." The return journey to Copper Falls became a race against time as they hurried to counter the false narratives being spread about their operation. But Catherine felt confident that the legal vindication they carried would provide decisive evidence against their accusers' credibility. They arrived in Copper Falls to find the town divided between those who believed the rumors being spread by Caldwell's agents and those who trusted their own observations of the partnership's legitimate operations. Mrs. Patterson met them at the boarding house with relief and concern. "Thank heavens you're back safely," she said, embracing Catherine warmly. "These past 2 weeks have been a trial, with strangers asking invasive questions and spreading tales that make no sense to anyone who actually knows you." Judge Morrison arrived within an hour of their return, eager to learn the results of their legal proceedings. When Daniel presented the official documents clearing his name of any criminal complications, the judge's satisfaction was evident. "This changes everything," Morrison declared. "Caldwell's agents have been using your supposed fugitive status as the basis for all their accusations about fraudulent business practices. With that foundation removed, their entire campaign collapses." The next morning brought the confrontation Catherine had been anticipating since first encountering Harrison Caldwell's aggressive tactics. The businessman arrived at the courthouse with 2 associates, clearly expecting to find their adversaries either fled or arrested based on the rumors his agents had been spreading. Instead, he found Daniel and Catherine waiting with Judge Morrison and a court reporter, prepared to address his accusations through formal legal proceedings rather than whispered rumors. "Mr. Caldwell," Judge Morrison began formally, "you've made serious allegations about fraudulent business practices and criminal associations regarding the Whitmore-Thorne Timber Partnership. These individuals are here to address those accusations directly and to request that you provide evidence supporting your claims." Caldwell's confidence wavered as he realized that his opponents had chosen to fight rather than flee. "My company's investigation has revealed irregularities that raise questions about the legitimacy of this partnership and its contracts." "What specific irregularities?" Catherine asked calmly, producing the comprehensive documentation they had prepared. "Our business records show full compliance with territorial partnership regulations, customer satisfaction that exceeds contract requirements, and financial practices that have been reviewed by qualified territorial prosecutors." The legal vindication from Colorado proved decisive in dismantling Caldwell's accusations. When Daniel presented the official documents clearing his name and reputation, the foundation for all claims about criminal association disappeared completely. "It appears your investigation was based on incomplete information, Mr. Caldwell," Judge Morrison observed. "Is your company prepared to retract the allegations made against this partnership?" Caldwell's retreat was swift once he realized that his campaign had not only failed, but had exposed his own organization to potential legal action for spreading false information about legitimate business operations. Within a week, the Territorial Development Corporation withdrew all interest in acquiring the Whitmore-Thorne timber operation and departed the region entirely. The resolution of their external threats allowed Catherine and Daniel to focus their attention on the personal relationship that had been growing alongside their business partnership. The challenges they had faced together had revealed compatibility that went far beyond shared professional interests. "Catherine," Daniel said one evening as they sat on her cabin porch watching sunset paint the valley in golden light, "I need to ask you something important." She turned toward him, sensing the significance of whatever he was preparing to say. "When you accepted partnership with me, it was a business arrangement based on mutual benefit and shared goals," he continued carefully. "But somewhere along the way, this became more than business for me. I need to know if you feel the same way." Catherine felt her heart accelerate as she recognized the moment she had been both hoping for and fearing. "Yes," she said simply. "This became more than business for me too." The kiss that followed was gentle but certain, carrying the weight of shared struggles and mutual respect that had grown between them over months of working together toward common goals. When they separated, Catherine felt that the final piece of her new life had fallen into place. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.